The year was 1258, and the city of Baghdad stood as one of the great jewels of the medieval world. Nestled along the banks of the Tigris River, the city had, for centuries, been a beacon of learning, wealth, and power. Founded in the 8th century by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, Baghdad had blossomed into the heart of a mighty empire. Its palaces glittered with gold and marble, its libraries brimmed with knowledge from across the known world, and its bustling markets drew merchants from China, India, and the Mediterranean. To the eyes of travelers, Baghdad was the very image of prosperity, its domes and minarets reflecting the light of the desert sun. But the glory of Baghdad also made it a target. To the east, the Mongol Empire, forged in the blood and conquest of Genghis Khan, and carried forward by his successors, loomed like a gathering storm. The Mongols were unlike any power the Abbasids had ever faced. Their empire stretched from the steppes of Mongolia across China, Central Asia, and into Eastern Europe. They were feared for their speed, their discipline, and above all their merciless destruction of those who opposed them. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols had already devastated cities such as Nishapur, Herat, and Samarkand, leaving behind fields of skulls and rivers choked with the bodies of the slain. To them, empires were merely obstacles to be broken, cities nothing more than prizes to be taken or erased from the map. When word spread that Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had been entrusted with a mission to march westward and subdue the Islamic world, the fate of Baghdad was sealed. Yet within the Abbasid Caliphate there was little preparation for what was to come. The once great empire had declined into a shadow of its former self. The caliphs who had once commanded vast armies and ruled lands stretching across continents now presided over little more than Iraq and parts of western Persia. Regional governors acted independently, and rival dynasties like the Seljuks and Ayyubids had long since overshadowed Abbasid authority. The caliph at the time, al-Mustasim, was a man better suited to courtly pleasures than to command. Though Baghdad remained a city of wealth and prestige, its defenses were neglected, its walls crumbling, and its army weak. Diplomacy had replaced military might, but diplomacy would prove useless against the Mongols. Hulagu's campaign began in the lands of Persia, where one by one the strongholds of the Ismaili assassins were brought low. The fortress of Alamut, perched high in the mountains and long thought impregnable, fell in 1256, marking the end of the feared sect's power. With their destruction, Hulagu freed himself to turn his attention to the Abbasids. The Mongol leader sent envoys to Baghdad, demanding submission. He expected tribute, surrender, and the dismantling of the caliph's authority. Al-Mustasim, however, refused. Perhaps he trusted in the prestige of the caliphate, believing that no Muslim ruler would dare side with the Mongols against the symbolic head of the Islamic world. Perhaps he underestimated the threat, thinking Baghdad's grandeur alone would deter invaders. Or perhaps he was simply blind to the gathering storm. His refusal would prove fatal, not only to himself but to his city. In 1257, Hulagu set his armies in motion. Reports from the time speak of an unstoppable tide. Hundreds of thousands of mounted warriors, engineers and auxiliaries drawn from across the Mongol domains. They carried with them not only bows and swords, but also the machinery of siege warfare. Catapults, mangonels and battering rams traveled alongside the horsemen, prepared to reduce even the strongest walls to rubble. Behind them followed supply trains and herds of livestock, sustaining the vast host as it advanced across the land. Their reputation preceded them, and the terror of their coming spread like wildfire. Cities surrendered without resistance, hoping to avoid annihilation. Baghdad, however, would not bend. By January 1258, the Mongols reached the outskirts of the Abbasid capital. They encircled the city, cutting it off from reinforcements and supplies. The Tigris River, once a lifeline of trade and sustenance, now became a barrier, its crossings secured by the enemy. Hulagu's forces constructed siege lines and fortified camps, tightening their grip with each passing day. The people of Baghdad, trapped within their walls, watched with growing dread as the Mongols prepared their engines of destruction. For 6 centuries, their city had stood as a center of civilization, seemingly untouchable. Now, for the first time, it faced an enemy capable of bringing it to its knees. Inside the city, The caliph's court descended into chaos. Advisors quarreled over how to respond. Some urged negotiation, pleading that surrender might preserve lives. Others called for resistance, invoking the duty to defend the faith and the caliphate. Al-Mustasim vacillated, unwilling to commit to either course decisively. Meanwhile, the defenders manned the crumbling walls, ill-equipped to withstand what was coming. The Mongols, experienced in the art of siege, began their assault with ruthless precision. Siege towers were rolled into position, catapults launched stones and incendiaries against the walls, and sappers undermined the foundations. Within days, breaches appeared, and the city's defenders fell back under the relentless pressure. As the siege dragged on, fear gripped Baghdad. The population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, faced starvation as supplies dwindled. Fires burned unchecked, spreading panic. Religious leaders called for prayer and repentance, but even faith seemed powerless before the storm. The Mongols tightened their stranglehold, and it became clear that no relief would come. Neighboring rulers, wary of the Mongols' wrath, offered no aid. The caliph, once regarded as the protector of Islam, now stood abandoned and alone. The fall of Baghdad was no longer a question of if, but when. The siege engines pounded without pause, each stone striking like a death knell for the Abbasid Caliphate. The once proud city trembled under the weight of an empire's doom, as the world held its breath for the cataclysm that was about to unfold. The final days of January 1258 marked the tightening of the Mongol noose around Baghdad. The city, once a beacon of learning and grandeur, now resembled a trapped animal, encircled by predators waiting for the kill. Hulagu Khan had positioned his army with ruthless efficiency, his siege lines stretching across the horizon, cutting off all hope of escape. The Mongols had brought with them engineers from China and Persia, masters of siegecraft, who understood how to break even the strongest fortifications. With their labor, the great engines of war rose like grim monuments outside the walls, towering catapults capable of hurling boulders that shattered stone, and siege towers that crept closer by the day. Inside Baghdad, the atmosphere was one of dread and disbelief. The Caliph al-Mustasim still hesitated, issuing conflicting orders as if he could not grasp the scale of what was happening. His generals begged him to lead from the front, but he remained secluded in his palace. Rumors swirled among the people. Some whispered that the caliph had secret allies who would come to their rescue. Others feared that the Mongols would leave no soul alive. The city's defenders, underfed and demoralized, manned the crumbling walls with what weapons they could muster. Against the tide that pressed against them, their resistance seemed futile. The Mongols began their bombardment in earnest. Massive stones crashed against the walls, shaking the ground with each impact. Arrows darkened the sky, striking indiscriminately into the crowded streets and towers. Fires broke out where incendiary missiles struck, and though the defenders rushed to extinguish them, the flames symbolized the unraveling of their hopes. Sappers tunneled beneath the walls, packing chambers with combustibles to bring sections crashing down. Day and night, the assault continued without pause, as if the Mongols themselves required no rest. Then came the breach. After days of relentless pounding, the defenses crumbled in several places, leaving gaping wounds in the city's outer walls. The Mongols surged forward, filling the breaches with waves of warriors. Cavalry thundered through the openings, cutting down anyone who dared resist. The defenders fought desperately, their cries echoing across the Tigris, but they were swept aside. The clash of steel, the screams of the dying, and the thunder of hooves blended into a chorus of destruction. Baghdad, for centuries untouchable, had been opened to the storm. As Mongol forces poured into the city, the scale of the slaughter began to unfold. They moved with systematic brutality, dividing the city into quarters and exterminating resistance wherever it appeared. No rank or station offered safety. Soldiers, scholars, merchants, and peasants alike fell beneath Mongol blades. The great mosques of Baghdad, once filled with prayer, became scenes of massacre. The streets ran with blood, and bodies piled high in alleys and squares. The Tigris, that lifeblood of the city, would soon carry more than just the commerce of empire. It would bear witness to a tide of corpses cast into its waters. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, retreated deeper into his palace as the devastation spread. His courtiers urged surrender, hoping that Hulagu's wrath might be tempered if the city yielded fully. But surrender had already come too late. The Mongols were not merely waging war, they were sending a message to the Islamic world. Resistance to their will would mean not just defeat, but annihilation. When the Caliph was finally brought before Hulagu, he appeared as a man broken, stripped of the grandeur and authority that had once made him the symbolic leader of the faithful. Accounts differ as to what transpired, but all agree that Hulagu rejected his pleas for mercy. The Mongols had no interest in preserving the Abbasid dynasty. One of the most haunting aspects of the fall was not only the slaughter of the people, but also the destruction of Baghdad's treasures. The city had been home to the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in the medieval world. Its libraries contained countless manuscripts, works of science, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and literature, drawn from across centuries and civilizations. As the Mongols set fire to the buildings or cast the volumes into the Tigris, the accumulated wisdom of generations was lost. Chroniclers later wrote that the river ran black with ink and red with blood, as if the destruction of life and knowledge were inseparable parts of the same tragedy. The massacre continued for days. Hulagu's men slaughtered at will, sparing only those whose skills or loyalty could serve the Mongol cause. Artisans, engineers, and scholars useful to the empire were selected out from the carnage and sent eastward to enrich Mongol domains. Everyone else was left to die. Some estimates from medieval sources claim that as many as 200,000 to 1,000,000 people perished in the sack of Baghdad, though modern historians debate the numbers. Regardless of the exact toll, the scale of the destruction was unprecedented. Baghdad, which had once been a city of 1,000,000 souls, was reduced to a silent graveyard. The death of the Caliph marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a political force. Though later Abbasids would establish a symbolic presence in Cairo under the patronage of the Mamluks, the glory of Baghdad's dynasty was gone. With his execution, the unbroken line of caliphal authority that had stretched back to the Prophet Es family through centuries of rule came to an abrupt and brutal end. The Mongols had done more than conquer a city. They had extinguished a symbol of unity for the Muslim world. Yet in the midst of destruction, there was also calculation. Hulagu understood the psychological impact of annihilating Baghdad. His campaign was not merely about territory, but about domination through terror. By destroying the greatest city of the Islamic world, he intended to cow neighboring states into submission. His message was clear: resist and face utter ruin, or submit and survive. And indeed, many rulers across the Middle East would reconsider their strategies in the shadow of Baghdad's fall. The sack of the city left scars not only on the landscape, but also on the collective memory of the region. Chroniclers from across the Islamic world wrote of the devastation in tones of disbelief and mourning. For them, it was not just a military defeat, but an act of cosmic significance, as though the very order of the world had been overturned. The fall of Baghdad was remembered as a catastrophe equal to the destruction of ancient empires, a rupture in history that marked the end of an era. In the silence that followed, the once vibrant streets of Baghdad lay desolate, palaces reduced to rubble, libraries turned to ash, markets emptied of life. The survivors, few and traumatized, wandered amid the ruins of what had been the pride of a civilization. The Mongols, having made their point, moved on, leaving behind a broken city. And yet, even as the dust settled over the corpses and charred stones, the world began to reckon with the deeper meaning of what had happened. For the fall of Baghdad in 1258 was more than a local tragedy. It was the collapse of a symbol of Islamic power, the loss of a center of knowledge that had nourished the world for centuries, and the demonstration of Mongol might at its most terrifying. The reverberations of that destruction would echo far beyond the walls of the ruined city, shaping the course of history in ways that none of its inhabitants could have foreseen. The silence that followed the Mongol withdrawal from Baghdad was as chilling as the destruction itself. Where once the city's streets had teemed with merchants and scholars, artisans and poets, now only silence and ruin remained. Smoke hung over the broken skyline, drifting like a funeral shroud across the Tigris. The air carried the stench of death, mingling with the charred remains of wood and stone. Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasids, had become a graveyard. Yet the consequences of its fall reached far beyond the city's ruined walls. The Islamic world, and indeed the wider world, recoiled in shock at the scale of the catastrophe. In Cairo, Damascus, and across the cities of Persia, word of the calamity spread swiftly. Chroniclers describe reactions of disbelief as if the unthinkable had come to pass. Baghdad had not merely been a city, it had been the beating heart of an entire civilization. For centuries, its caliphs had stood as the symbolic leaders of Islam, even as their political authority waned. To many, the caliphate represented continuity with the early centuries of the faith, an institution that embodied legitimacy and unity. With al-Mustasim dead and his dynasty shattered, that continuity seemed severed. The sense of disorientation was profound. If Baghdad could fall, if the caliph himself could be dragged from his palace and executed by infidels, what certainty remained? Religious scholars sought to interpret the disaster in cosmic terms. Some saw it as divine punishment for the sins of the Muslims, a chastisement meant to bring repentance. Others viewed it as a test of faith, a trial in which believers must endure suffering. Theologians debated the meaning of the caliphate's fall and whether leadership of the Muslim community could ever be restored. The psychological blow was immense, for it was not only a political institution that had been destroyed, but also a symbol of divine order in the world. The intellectual loss was no less staggering. Baghdad had been a center of learning unrivaled in the medieval era. Its house of wisdom, built centuries earlier by the Abbasid caliphs, had gathered texts from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. Scholars translated and preserved works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, ensuring that knowledge survived even as empires rose and fell. In its libraries were housed treasures that connected the Islamic world to the legacy of antiquity. With their destruction, countless volumes were lost forever. The writings of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid, preserved and studied by Muslim scholars, had nourished generations of thinkers. Now many of those texts vanished into the flames or the waters of the Tigris. The symbolic image of ink-stained waters became one of the most enduring legends of the sack. Chroniclers described the river turning black from the dissolved manuscripts cast into it by Mongol soldiers. Whether literal or exaggerated, the image captured the sense that a great chapter of human knowledge had ended. Though fragments survived, and though centers of learning would endure in Cairo, Damascus, and elsewhere, Baghdad's destruction left a void that could never be fully filled. Neighboring powers reacted with a mixture of fear and calculation. The Crusader states, remnants of Christian rule along the Levantine coast, watched events with unease. Though they had long been at war with Muslim powers, the Mongol advance unsettled them as much as their traditional enemies. If Baghdad, that mighty city, had fallen, what chance did their small coastal holdings have should Hulagu turn westward? In fact, some Crusader leaders flirted with the idea of alliance, hoping to harness Mongol might against their foes. Yet the Mongols were not Crusaders, nor were they loyal allies. Their ambition was empire, not holy war. To the south, in Egypt, the Mamluks grasped the enormity of the moment. These slave soldiers, who had seized control of the Sultanate, understood that they now stood on the frontier of Mongol expansion. With Baghdad crushed, there was little to stand between Hulagu's forces and Cairo. The Mamluks prepared, fortifying their armies and sharpening their resolve. For them, survival depended not only on military readiness, but also on rallying the Muslim world under their banner. In time, they would present themselves as the new defenders of Islam, guardians of the faith against the Mongol menace. The political vacuum left by the Abbasid collapse also reconfigured the map of the Middle East. Local dynasties, long overshadowed by the prestige of Baghdad, now maneuvered for influence. In Persia, the Ilkhanate emerged as a Mongol-controlled kingdom, ruled by Hulagu and his descendants. Though they would eventually adopt aspects of Persian administration and even Islam itself, their presence transformed the balance of power. To the east, Mongol rule extended across Central Asia, binding the Islamic world into the orbit of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the shores of China. Yet the destruction of Baghdad also carried consequences for the Mongols themselves. Their victory was total, but it also marked the limits of their advance. While Hulagu had crushed the Abbasids, his armies would soon face resistance they could not so easily overcome. The Mamluks of Egypt, hardened soldiers with a cause, would check Mongol expansion in the decisive battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. That clash, only 2 years after Baghdad's fall, would demonstrate that the Mongols, though formidable, were not invincible. The sack of Baghdad thus stood both as their greatest triumph and as a prelude to the limits of their empire. For the people of the Middle East, however, the wound remained raw. Generations remembered the sack as a nightmarish turning point, the end of an age of splendor and the beginning of an era of fragmentation. Later, poets and historians would evoke the destruction in mournful tones, recalling the rivers of blood, the libraries burned, and the caliphate extinguished. To them, it was not simply a battle or even a conquest, but a cataclysm that reshaped the trajectory of history. In Europe, too, the fall of Baghdad was noted with fascination and dread. News traveled along trade routes and through diplomatic channels, carried by merchants, monks, and envoys. Some Christian chroniclers rejoiced at the humiliation of the caliphate, long viewed as a rival power. Others, however, saw in the Mongols a threat that transcended religious lines. The same armies that had crushed Baghdad had also ridden into Hungary and Poland only a few years earlier. To them, the sack was a reminder that the Mongol tide could sweep across any kingdom, Christian or Muslim alike. Thus, the destruction of Baghdad reverberated across continents. It was an event that transcended borders, reshaping the mental and political landscapes of Eurasia. To the people who lived through it, it seemed as though the world itself had shifted, that an old order had been swept away by fire and steel. Yet even amid the ashes, new forces were gathering. The Mamluks, the Ilkhanate, the rising powers of Anatolia, all would shape the next chapter of the Middle East. But the memory of Baghdad's fall remained, a scar upon history, a warning of how even the mightiest cities could fall in a single storm of violence. And so, as the 13th century pressed on, the world carried the memory of 1258 as both a lesson and a wound. Baghdad, once the unrivaled center of learning and culture, had been reduced to ruins. The caliphate, once the unifying institution of Islam, lay extinguished. The Mongols had shown that no symbol, no tradition, no city was beyond their reach. Yet in the ruins, the seeds of resistance were already taking root, and the story of the struggle against Mongol domination was far from over. In the months that followed the sack of Baghdad, the Mongols set about consolidating their victory. The Abbasid capital lay in ruins, but Hulagu Khan had no intention of simply leaving devastation behind. For the Mongols, conquest was both an act of terror and a strategy of empire. By erasing Baghdad, Hulagu had struck at the heart of the Islamic world, but he also sought to establish his authority over the lands he now controlled. Out of the rubble of the Abbasid Caliphate would rise a new dominion, the Ilkhanate, one of the 4 great Khanates that emerged from the vast Mongol Empire. The Ilkhanate encompassed Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia, and its establishment marked a transformation of Mongol rule in the region. Unlike the raids that had characterized earlier Mongol campaigns, Hulagu's settlement signaled an intent to govern. His court, though still steeped in Mongol traditions, drew upon Persian administrators and local elites to manage the complex societies now under his control. Taxation, land distribution, and infrastructure became tools of domination, ensuring that the Mongol grip extended beyond the battlefield. Yet the memory of Baghdad's annihilation remained ever present, a reminder to subjects of what defiance would bring. For many across the Middle East, the Mongols seemed unstoppable. City after city fell before their advance, their reputation preceding them like a shadow. Yet the sheer scale of their conquests also brought them into conflict with other great powers. Chief among these were the Mamluks of Egypt. Born from a corps of enslaved soldiers, the Mamluks had seized power in Cairo only a few years before the sack of Baghdad. Fierce warriors, trained from youth in the arts of combat, they had risen from bondage to rule one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. The fall of Baghdad had shocked the Mamluks as much as anyone, but it also steeled their resolve. They understood that with the Abbasids gone, they were now the bulwark of Islam. Cairo, their capital, would become the new center of political and religious legitimacy, and in the years to come they would install a surviving Abbasid prince as a symbolic caliph under their protection. But legitimacy alone was not enough. To face the Mongols, the Mamluks had to rely on their own strength. The stage for confrontation was set as Hulagu continued his march westward. His forces advanced into Syria, capturing Aleppo and Damascus with the same ferocity that had marked Baghdad's destruction. The ancient cities fell, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their mosques desecrated. Panic spread across the Levant as rulers scrambled to decide whether to submit or resist. Many chose submission, hoping to avoid the fate of Baghdad. Yet the Mongol tide could not advance unchecked forever. In 1260, a turning point arrived. Hulagu's advance was interrupted by events far to the east. The death of the great Khan Mungke, Hulagu's elder brother, triggered a succession crisis within the Mongol Empire. As tradition required, Hulagu withdrew the bulk of his forces to return east and take part in the political struggle. He left behind a smaller contingent in Syria, commanded by one of his trusted generals, Kitbuka. This decision, dictated by Mongol politics, created an opening for their enemies. The Mamluks seized the moment. Under the leadership of Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars, they prepared to confront the Mongols head-on. At Ain Jalut, in the hills of Palestine, the two forces clashed in a battle that would decide the fate of the Middle East. The Mongols, though fierce, were outmaneuvered by the disciplined Mamluk cavalry. Using feigned retreats and ambushes, the Mamluks turned the tide and dealt the Mongols their first major defeat in open battle. Kitbuka was slain, and the myth of Mongol invincibility was broken. The victory at Ain Jalut reverberated across the Islamic world. It was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a spiritual and psychological victory. The sack of Baghdad had left Muslims reeling, convinced that no power could resist the Mongols. Ain Jalut proved otherwise. The Mamluks, heirs to the fallen Abbasids in all but name, had demonstrated that the conquerors could be checked, that resistance was possible. Cairo now stood as the center of a revived Islamic authority, and the Mamluks claimed the mantle of defenders of the faith. For the Mongols, the loss did not erase the triumph of Baghdad, but it reshaped their strategy. Hulagu returned to Persia, where he consolidated his rule over the Ilkhanate. Though his armies continued to raid and fight in the Levant, they would never again achieve the unchallenged dominance that had characterized the sack of Baghdad. The balance of power had shifted, and the Mongols had to contend not only with the Mamluks, but also with their own internal divisions. The fall of Baghdad had redrawn the political map of the Middle East. The Abbasid Caliphate, once a symbol of unity, was gone, replaced by the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. Between them lay a frontier of conflict that would define the coming decades. The Mongols, for all their devastation, had inadvertently paved the way for the rise of the Mamluks as the leading power in the Islamic world. Cairo became the center of scholarship, commerce, and religion, inheriting the mantle once held by Baghdad. Yet the memory of Baghdad lingered like a ghost. Even as Cairo flourished, Muslims remembered the city that had once been the pride of their civilization. Poets mourned its loss, historians chronicled its destruction, and preachers invoked its fall as a warning of divine wrath. The ruins themselves became a symbol, a cautionary tale etched into the landscape of Mesopotamia. Travelers passed through and wrote of the devastation, of toppled minarets and silent libraries. For generations, Baghdad remained a scar upon the memory of Islam, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. The wider world also absorbed the lessons of 1258. In Europe, monarchs and churchmen debated the Mongol menace with renewed urgency. Some dreamed of alliance, imagining that the Mongols might be turned against their Muslim rivals. Others feared that the same forces that had annihilated Baghdad might one day descend upon their own cities. To the east, in China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty watched closely, noting both the heights of Hulagu's success and the limits imposed by Ain Jalut. The Mongol Empire, though vast, was not unbounded. As the years passed, the sack of Baghdad became a symbol of the 13th century's upheavals, a moment when the old order collapsed and new powers rose from the wreckage. It was a reminder of the fragility of civilizations, of how quickly centuries of achievement could be undone in a single campaign. Yet it was also a prelude to renewal. Out of the ashes, Cairo rose as a new center of learning. The Ilkhanate, though born of conquest, became a bridge between Mongol and Islamic worlds, and Baghdad itself, though shattered, would one day revive, scarred but not erased from history. The story of 1258 did not end with destruction. It echoed through the battles, alliances, and cultural transformations that followed. It reshaped the Middle East and altered the trajectory of empires. Above all, it left behind a question that would haunt generations. How could a city so mighty, so rich in culture and faith, fall so swiftly to the storm of war? The answer lay not only in the strength of the Mongols, but in the weaknesses of the Abbasids, the shifting currents of politics, and the inevitability of change in the tides of history.